So our panel consists of Dr. Amy Orben. Amy is a neuroscientist. She's a research fellow at Emmanuel College, very near here, and a visiting research fellow at the Medical Research Council's Cognition and Brain Science Unit here in the University of Cambridge. We're then going to hear from Dr. James Williams, who's a research fellow at the University of Oxford, although I believe he's currently in Turkey rather than Oxford, who's an author, winner of the 9 Dots Prize, and looking at philosophical and ethical questions about digital technologies. And then we have one of our very own, Dr. Tyler Shores, who is manager of the university's ThinkLab program, who we work with very often. He trained with a doctorate in the education faculty and is also a senior research associate of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. So it's wonderful to have such an amazing panel with us. Amy, if we could start off with you.
So thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Amy Orben, as introduced, and I've actually spent today talking with teenagers about social media use because I research how social media impacts adolescents' mental health and well-being, and that's what I want to talk about today. But actually having conversation with the users on the ground is very interesting because we need to think about our questions around technologies in both a current perspective, but also in a historical perspective to really understand what questions we as academics are asking and also kind of what the conclusion should be from the research that we're doing. So I started becoming interested in the historics of why we talk about technologies when I was finishing my PhD at the University of Oxford. And I came across this paper when I was trying to find a quote around other technologies people were concerned about. And I'm a psychologist, and so this was very close to home. This is an article by Mary Preston written in 1941, published in the Journal of Pediatrics, about children's reactions to movie horrors and radio crime. So what she was writing about was the impact she thought radio programs and movie programs were having on children, because and to understand how they were impacting their lives. And what she found was very worrying for her, and she wrote this paper. She found that the majority of the children she studied, it was about a bit over 100, were severely addicted to radio drama. And she wrote that these radio drama scenes can have an inhibitory effect on the functioning of every organ in the body, and that most of these addicted teenagers and children utilize the addiction as an escape from reality, much as a chronic alcoholic does drink. This resonated with me because it could have almost been about social media and kind of written in the 2020s, and I couldn't have seen much of a difference. There are more similarities to kind of Mary Preston in the 1940s writing about the radio to me in the 2020s writing about social media. And we within a time of massive technological change. Then between the 1930s to 1950s, so in the 1940s, there was a spike in the use of the radio, and it was kind of almost went into the vast majority of households all over the United States. I think we're in a similar position now where technologies like social media and smartphones have naturally a bit quicker than the radio, but have infiltrated most of our homes and impacted almost most aspects of our lives. And anything that goes into the home and changes our behaviors, and especially changes our behaviors and those of our children, causes a lot of concern. So this is a quote from the director of the Child Study Association of America about the radio in the 1930s, saying that no locks will keep this intruder out, nor can parents shift their children away from it. Similarly, a parenting magazine wrote about the radio in 1939, almost as how we talk about social media today. And just think about kind of how it relates to how we think now. Here's a device that is everywhere. We may question the quality of its offering for our children. We may approve or deplore its entertainment and enchantment, but we are powerless to shut it out. It comes into our very homes and captures our children before our very eyes. So I'm not talking about social media, well, about the radio to say that our concerns about social media are overblown or stupid. there is a kind of natural human drive to have concerns about new technologies that comes around. And so we need to, and maybe in this session, we can untangle a bit about what makes kind of this current phase of technological change that we're in different, and what do we want to know about it. So having kind of quickly rushed through this past overview or kind of perspective couple of slides, I want to talk a bit more about what I do on a day-to-day basis, which is not reading historical papers. It's actually thinking about the impacts of social media on the youngest in our population. And here things are very complicated. And I'll explain a bit more in this last bit of my talk. So a lot of us have seen, I grew up in this space as an academic when Jeremy Hunt was still Minister for Health in the UK, saying that social media poses a great threat to children's obesity. And researchers were claiming that social media was like drugs, or that it was destroying a generation. And this really made me want to question whether things were really that simple. I used social media as a teenager myself, and that's what really brought me into that research area. So what do we know about the link between social media and mental health? And I'll focus specifically on teens here because that's who I know best. The first thing is that we know, here I put screen time, but we know that the link between social media use and adolescent well-being is mainly negative. So that means that if I open a data set and I look at it has questions around maybe how much a teenager uses social media and also how well they're feeling, of those teenagers that use more social media most often also score lower on these mental health questionnaires. This opens up a couple of questions to researchers, because on the one hand, it could be that social media causes a decrease in mental health and well-being. It could, however, also be that those people who feel worse or have different coping mechanisms to mental struggles, you start using technology like social media more. Or it could be a third factor that kind of influences both. And an example of that is socioeconomic status. So in the US, we know that families of lower socioeconomic status, their children use more technology. That could be because there's less after-school activity provision or because the parents are working more. And also that they score lower on these mental health and well-being questionnaires. And so without there being any causal link between social media use and well-being, we might be finding this negative correlation. The next thing I want to talk about is the size. So whenever we're talking about, impacting policy change, we need to think about the size of the effects we're actually talking about. And here, the size of this negative link is very small. Naturally, if a very small effect is scaled over the world's population, it's still very important. So again, it doesn't tell us anything about the importance itself. But what we see is, this is work of mine published in 2019, where we looked at the correlation between technologies and well-being, which is at the bottom here, and how it relates to the correlation of, for example, your left or right-handed and well-being, or your height with well-being, or your bicycle use with well-being, or wearing glasses with well-being. And we see that, for example, the correlation between wearing glasses and well-being is more negative and larger than the correlation we have between wearing technologies and well-being, while height and bicycle use, again, in the same ballpark as technology use, but on the other side. However, again, these are correlations and don't tell us much. So a lot of the research area trying to figure out the impact of social media has moved towards longitudinal studies and some experimental studies that I can talk about in the questions. But the longitudinal studies allow us to look at least some of these relations. Does more social media use lead to, for example, lower life satisfaction, or does lower life satisfaction lead to more social media use? And the study of over 15,000 UK adolescents, what me and my colleagues found is that both of these pathways are there. So social media use, an increase in social media use predicted a decrease in life satisfaction on an individual level. But also, if an individual's life satisfaction decreased in 1 year, that predicted an increase in social media use. So I think the effects of social media are probably even more complicated than these bidirectional associations. But it shows us that, social media affecting our lives is one direction, but our lives also affect our social media use. And that might be something interesting to reflect on throughout today's theme about how social media use is affecting our lives. Furthermore, the kind of effects of technology and, for example, social media are highly individual. The way I explain this, for example, to journalists is often using the metaphor of a chocolate bar. So if you ask a scientist to predict how a specific adolescent, maybe that you choose from your class, is impacted by eating a chocolate bar, you would know that the scientist would need a lot more information to make any sort of conclusion. Is the child a diabetic? Well, then eating that chocolate bar might be quite harmful, and severe diabetic stance could require medical attention. However, the child has just come off the football pitch or is, very physically involved, then eating that chocolate bar might help replenish their energy levels. We'd also want to know the frequency of them eating this chocolate bar. Is it every minute, every hour, every day? Is it their birthday? And also the motivations. Are they eating this chocolate bar because they're hungry, because they're tired, or because they're lonely? All of these questions relate to how we think this chocolate bar might impact a specific individual, child, or young person. And similarly, around technologies, we need to ask similar questions. What is the type of use? What is the type of user? What is the motivation? What is the content? All of these things matter. For example, just to give you a quick kind of example, the type of use in research, a lot of people have been splitting social media into active use and passive use. So active use is when you're scrolling. Sorry, I'll start again. Active use is when you're, for example, chatting to friends or liking a post or messaging someone. And that direct interaction with people or indirect interaction can increase feelings of social connectedness, leading to increases in well-being. But we could also use social media differently, just by scrolling through different types of content, by not interacting with other people, so kind of more passively using it. And research has shown this might lead to more social comparison, so us comparing ourselves to others, which might well lead to a decrease in well-being. So, I could talk for 2-3 hours about these individual effects of social media, but something we need to kind of keep in mind is that we cannot make generalized conclusions about how such a diverse technology impacts such a diverse population as ours. So lastly, we know that this link is really lacking in evidence. So Dame Sally Davies used to be the Chief Medical Officer for England and is now a master here at Trinity College in Cambridge. And when I was still at Oxford, she did a big investigation into social media and its impact on children's health and well-being. And there she found that actually there is not enough evidence to give any concrete recommendations, for example, how many minutes a child or young person should spend on social media. And that is pretty much because it is so dependent on the type of use and the type of user. So in the end, it's all very complicated, as I said at the very beginning. But it's important questions we need to answer in terms of giving people guidance and, for example, giving parents guidance or educators guidance around social media use of adolescents and teens. So in my last 2 slides, I just want to highlight 2 really great resources around social media and screen use for parents of children and young people. The first is the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health has some great guidelines around kind of not focusing on the minutes of screen use, that is right or wrong, but instead that screen use should be benefiting the household in certain ways and not kind of the family building their lives around screens. And also the UK Council for Internet Safety has some great resources around the need to build digital resilience. So instead of kind of shutting down different ways to learn and understand technologies by overdue restrictions, to actually help children and young people understand, learn, know, and recover in the digital space. So I'm happy to talk about in the questions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amy. That was really fascinating. It was really interesting to drill down through some of the effects and that idea that it's not quite as simple as social media good, social media bad. And I think it was really good to get some of that nuance. So I can see some questions coming in already. But can we move on to take, we have a number of them coming in. Reminder, please do sign up on the Q&A tab to put those questions in. But before we do, can we hear from the second member of our panel, James Williams? James, over to you.
Hello, hi, thanks, Julian. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today, especially during this very interesting and surreal time we're all living through. So I'm going to kind of just assume most people are probably familiar with a certain kind of narrative about technology, social media, and some of the questions that already exist, out in the discourse around that, as evidenced by your attendance at this today. So what I thought I would do is kind of just say a few points on to kind of further complicate our organizing question. Is a few points about the way in which we kind of talk about these questions of social media, digital technology today, and then after that, kind of just a few points, a few observations from my work on kind of questions of autonomy and attention. And then I'm really looking forward to the conversation because I'm curious what kinds of questions you guys have. So, so my story is that I worked at Google for about 10 years, mostly in the area of search advertising, and I had always kind of had this belief that more technology is good, more information is good, and I kind of several years ago I started to in my own life realize that there were these kinds of effects, whether they were called distraction, kind of just an existential confusion, things like this. The technology wasn't always having the sort of effect in my life. It wasn't building my own capacities to do the things I wanted to do in the way I wanted. And so I felt like there was something very important happening when it comes to kind of the question of attention, question of autonomy. So that's what led me to Oxford to do my research in that at the Oxford Internet Institute. And so my work is kind of at the intersection of, I guess, kind of design, engineering, ethics, philosophy, and I guess to some degree now the kind of the political questions around the kind of political economy of tech, and kind of especially the question of like the attention economy. So what I'm going to, I guess, talk about first is just a few ways in which I, over that course of, since I started working at Google, the way I've seen these questions of social media be talked about, because I really want to agree with and want to echo Amy's point about the way we ask these questions is extremely important. Because I think if we don't start with the right, questions framed in the right way, we're not going to sort of get to the answers that we want and need. So when this term, I've always kind of, sometimes I really annoy my friends when I keep bringing up this point to them, but I really think the term social media is in need of some kind of further elaboration or like a kind of a reboot. So I mean, I remember when Facebook first started getting big, and people started using this term social media, and I think the people that I saw who were first kind of popularizing it and had an interest in it getting used were actually the social media marketing agencies. So people who had started a company to basically help other companies make a Facebook page or whatever. And so it kind of caught on as this kind of loose general term, but I really think that a lot of the time it complicates the questions more than it elucidates them. Because if we think about what counts as social media, and I don't think this is just a pedantic point. I think it's actually fairly important. I think we don't talk about things like email or SMS messaging or even newer things like kind of like Twitch or online games or maybe non-advertising based platforms or kind of federated social media like Mastodon or something. We mostly talk about like Facebook and Twitter because they're the big behemoths. But I think even when people use the term social media, I think at the end of the day, what I've seen is people just end up talking about Facebook. And Facebook is certainly big and certainly important, but I think I think ultimately, like at the end of the day, like we need this sort of language for talking about what are sort of, whether it's sort of the design logic or like kind of the incentives that guide the design or particular types of interactions or use cases, something like this. Basically, I think our vocabulary and our kind of grammar for these platforms, these services is is lacking, and I think that there's a big opportunity to kind of elaborate that out. It's kind of similar to other kind of tech, kind of big, terms like big data or AI or things like this. So I think that the way we sort of talk about social media, the way we bound it, really is important. So I think that's one point I would make in all this. Another point I make is that whenever I kind of talk to people about this, I think there's a kind of bouncing back and forth a lot of time between talking about in terms of kind of the individual effects of social media. How does it affect me as a user? My autonomy, my well-being, my happiness, mental state, etc. Versus kind of the more systemic effects that social media is having, and they could be, those could be about the way that social media and its dynamics are shaping politics. It could be about the way in which the particular types of rewards we get from social media cause us to pursue certain types of reinforcement, like approval, fame, etc. And I think one thing that really is important in this space is kind of the metaphors that we use. So drugs are often used as a metaphor for talking about social media in terms of individual effects. I think sometimes that backgrounds the collective effects. I think that actually a really good metaphor I've come to use more and more is the metaphor of climate change, because at the end of the day, I see kind of the question of social media, and I guess I would say the attention economy more generally, as kind of akin to climate change, in that they're kind of the two big environmental kind of crises of our time, which is one's about the outer environment and one's about the inner environment. So I think the way we talk about those individual versus collective effects and dynamics is really important, and making sure that we're sort of not foregrounding one to the exclusion of the other. A third way I think that I've seen conversations about social media go is when there are discussions about content to the exclusion of discussions about the form. So there are a lot of important debates and conversations about fake news, misinformation, all this kind of stuff. But I think there are many other considerations that are just as important, if not more important, about the kinds of habits of thought, the kinds of values that we end up kind of taking on when we sort of internalize a lot of these the dynamics of social media. So I think thinking of in terms of form and not just the content is important too. And then I guess one last one that I would say, there's a lot here, but and I think I forget the paper that found this, but it was a research paper that noted that a lot of the people, when they talk about the features of a social media platform, this paper found they tended to use metaphors from the natural world. So like the news feed on Facebook is kind of like a river. Basically, they were kind of relating them to these like immutable, given facts of nature. And I think that's interesting because coming from the tech industry, like you sort of see behind the scenes, a lot of the stuff it's explicitly designed. It's a certain way, not just because that's how it came out. It's specifically to achieve a certain purpose, and it could absolutely have been otherwise. And so I think that that's another perspective that it's important to think about in a lot of these conversations. Is it doesn't have to be the way it is. There's like a multiplicity of worlds, multiplicity of outcomes, the ways that social media could be, multiplicity then of lives that we could be living. And I think the question of why is the system constructed such that we're going down this path and not that path? I think remembering that other possible path exists, I think, is important, because especially when it gets into kind of the questions of kind of moralization of technology, like Amy was talking about, it's not just the case that either we have a certain kind of technology or we don't. It's that, well, why specifically is it this way, and who benefits, and and then I guess like to what extent do we have the kind of control over that that we want to have? And so I think to that end, I think one of the things that I've been calling for lately, or ways that I've been kind of putting the kind of conversation I would like to see more about social media is, like I'm very pro technology, and still I think, because I see all the great things that it could do for human life, and but basically I think what we need to do is kind of up level the criticism in the same way that we have literary art criticism, not because people don't like certain they don't like literature or art. It's because they want to hold it to a higher standard, and it's a project of kind of elevating it, teasing out the nuances of it. So I feel like tech criticism isn't quite there yet. It's still largely at a place where it's kind of this all or nothing sort of stuff. And a lot of that is in part due to the dynamics of social media, the attention economy. But I would like to see us get to a place where we can just kind of identify what those higher standards are for technology and the the business models, the economic sort of higher level inputs that guide the design, and essentially elevate the kind of conversation and have a real like a new type of tech criticism. So those were just a few kind of disparate points about the way that some of these conversations happen. And then so I guess the second part then, in terms of my own work, what I've focused on a lot is kind of the question of attention and holding it up next to kind of the question of autonomy. And autonomy is, of course, on various psychological and philosophical conceptions of well-being. It's a core component of that. And I think it's also important because it's also kind of a kind of capacity that helps us pursue those other elements of well-being, whether that's relatedness, competence, or whatever else the theory of well-being that you're using might include. So I think broadly speaking, if we think of autonomy as like kind of the ability to respond to things on the basis of reasons that we have, which is one conception of autonomy. I think it's an interesting question to ask, in our own lives and society, like when does social media give us new reasons for responding to things? When does it sort of just override reasons that we might have that we either come to it with or remember later after it takes us down a rabbit hole of Reddit for 2 hours or whatever. So what I've kind of tried to do is think about the question of autonomy using the language of attention. And I won't go into a lot of the details here, but in my book it kind of goes into this in more detail. But basically, this kind of the idea that there's kind of like three levels of the question. So one is the question of are we able to do what we want to do, in the moment, in the task domain, and then second, are we able to kind of live the lives we want to live, pursue those longer term goals we want to have, live by the values we want to have, and then thirdly, are we able to sort of keep up leveling our capacities so we can define and pursue those things we want to do and the people we want to be, whether that's the capacities like like knowledge or reason, imagination, self-regulation, all these kinds of things. So it kind of uses the philosopher Harry Frankfurt's kind of three-part structure of the human will. And so I won't go into a lot of the details of that, but we can in the questions if you guys are interested in it. But basically, I think this is another thing that I guess lastly, like I feel like it needs to sort of be extended, is kind of like really like broadening our language for what's at stake, because and this is one thing I was trying to do with my book is to show that at the end of the day it's not sort of like just we get distracted or I don't end up doing the things I wanted to do today, that adds up over the course of days and weeks and a life. And I think what's really at stake in the question of social media, which to a large degree is the kind of structure of our, especially in the COVID era, structure of our interaction, if not increasingly our own cognition. What's at stake is the success of our own lives, and I think never before in history has there been the possibility for a globally distributed but centrally controlled platform that uses the best algorithmic logic and has some of the best engineers in the world aimed at just capturing our attention and keeping our attention. And to me, I think it's an enormous moment of political import. And I think there's an opportunity to get this right, but I think it requires continuing to think about the systemic questions, the questions of the political economy, and then specifically articulating the standards that we have for the business models, economic systems, for the design, so that we can then start to hold these platforms accountable. Because there are important descriptive scientific questions to ask, but I think there are just as many important normative, political, ethical questions to ask about all this as well. And so hopefully we can discuss some of those in the questions section. So I'll stop there on those points, and then we can dive into any particular points that are of interest in the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And again, some really interesting thoughts there about how we ought to be thinking, that individual versus group behavior. And I thought the idea that social media and the effects, whatever words you want to use, and climate change are sort of two of the biggest threats we face. One about the sort of epistemic threat about how we act as individuals, how we interact with each other, and the other about the power of nature. But I'm delighted to have last, but by no means least, as I said, our very own Tyler Shores. Tyler, over to you.
Thanks, Julian. I see a lot of good questions coming up, so I'll try to keep my section a little bit short, and then hopefully we'll be able to chat with you all. I'm sending a link right now. I have a few slides. I'll get to the link in a second, but here we go. I'll cover some of the things. I'll touch on a few of the things that both Amy and James have mentioned. Oops, excuse me. Let's go back here. So I'm Tyler, as Julian mentioned, and similar to James, kind of an interesting career trajectory. I also worked at Google in the main office in Mountain View, California. I worked on a program called Authors at Google, where we would bring speakers, and we were basically TED Talks before TED Talks was a thing. So that was kind of cool. I worked in social media, on social media at Stanford University prior to coming to Cambridge, and then also worked in online behavior and analytics. What gets people to click? What are the keywords and the elements of the website that attract people and do these things? Since coming to Cambridge, my research is in digital distractions, and then most recently I managed the ThinkLab program. So, which the ThinkLab program basically brings together researchers from all over the university, different disciplines, to tackle kind of larger real world problems and these sort of things. And that's basically what I've been up to. And I thought I'd break this up into a few parts here. So the question of social media, right? It's our relationship to social media is certainly complicated. In the link that I just sent you, this is more for fun. This is a shockingly unscientific way of polling and getting your information, your opinions on these sort of things. But I did a couple of polls just to see, more, again, just to kind of and feel free to add to the votes if you'd like to, but just to get a little sample of what our habits are in daily life. I thought this one was interesting from a couple of hours ago. Have you made any connections through social media that you consider meaningful? So that's pretty good. Over 80% were thinking yes. How are our habits? How does social media use in our online habits possibly shape the contours of our everyday behavior and things? Do you check social media first thing in the morning? 70% say yes. And first thing, I mean first thing before you do any other things. Often it's because you might be using your phone as an alarm clock to pick up the phone, see the notifications and these sort of things. So that's what I had in mind. In my own research, it's actually a little higher than this. It's actually closer to 85-90% say yes. And then most recently, the poll that I just sent over in Zoom, if you'd like to take a look at it right now. And I was like, are you affected by how many likes you get on social media? Again, just curious. There's nothing to this other than it's a way to build in a little bit of interaction, but I'm curious if you have thoughts on these things. So this is a more even one. I'm going to talk about some of these things on an individual basis as we go here, but I want to talk a little bit about social media and ourselves, right? It probably goes without saying. And the other thing is, because I'm running short on time, I'm going to cheat here. And then any of the links that I mentioned, I will tweet out later tonight if possible. So that's one way I can kind of skip some of the things. And if it's interesting food for thought, feel free to grab those links. You don't need a Twitter account in order to grab these links necessarily, because my account is public. So no big deal there. But anyways, what I want to mention is, we are more than our social media posts or profiles, right? I know that sounds very obvious, but the funny thing about habits is that they do sneak up on us, and so do our patterns of thinking and the way that we start thinking about ourselves and the way that we relate to other people. It's harder to see that now, I think, because social media is often our primary engagement. The fact that we're all, sitting in our own homes, not getting as much face-to-face contact as before. Social media does feel more like possibly our primary means of interacting with the rest of the world and the people around us. But I just want to think. So I'm really just kind of posing open-ended thought questions in terms of what would happen right now, for example, if our social media profiles all disappeared tomorrow morning. Wake up, want to check our phones. What would it be like? Actually think about that for a second. For one thing, how would we register our outrage to the rest of the world? We could shout out a window. We could, send a bunch of emails to people, but we'd be losing that. But just what would we do differently? I'm just curious to kind of it's an interesting mental exercise, I feel like. But that exercise, I think, also makes us think a little bit in terms of just how we relate, how much it is kind of ingrained into our habit and our thinking. Shifting topics just a little bit, I was kind of thinking about this too. The idea of just sort of what's the like? What is an engagement nowadays on social media? It can mean a lot of things, right? It's a signal of something, but it's not always a precise signal. How many of us, for example, have had a post that we really liked and wanted to see what others were very eager to see if others thought the same thing? I do. It's the feeling of, kind of and I kind of hate that feeling personally. Of sort of waiting, and it's why do we do this? Because we like that we're social creatures, right? But we also kind of we want a little bit of that affirmation. I thought this was clever. Did other people think this was clever? I accomplished this thing. Sometimes we get envious. Sometimes, if we're posting something that we worked really hard on or wanted to announce, we like that. And we might get a twinge of, why did they get so many likes? It's just a new baby. It's just a, whatever. Why is that the thing? But the thing that I would kind of mention, and I'm going to talk about our relation to other selves and these sort of things too, is that, again, what I kind of opened with, the idea that we are more than just social media profiles, right? We're also contradictory. We change our minds. And I want to extend that too to the question of our relationship with ourselves. So this is actually back to this, the fact that we have different ways that we think about ourselves. We're more than just who we are online. Is it a reflection of who we really feel like we are? Is it a curated self? Sometimes I feel like that's a lot of the case, but keeping that in mind for other people too can also be sort of helpful, that the person that we engage with, the stranger, the person we kind of know on social media, knowing that they are more than the sum of their posts or the sum of their profiles too, can actually be really helpful at times. I think there's a number of ways to think about it. And social media, I don't think any of us are anti-social media by any means. I'd be super hypocritical of me posting Twitter links and these sort of things and all of that. But I mean, there is a lot of good, right? Since the pandemic and all of that, it's helped us be connected. It's been our lifeline to the rest of the world. We can still kind of keep in touch with family and loved ones and friends and colleagues and everything in between. In its best, social media feels like a big group hug, right? Like it's a sense of community. It makes us feel less alone. It makes us feel that our experiences are not just us. There's a feeling of other people are going through the same thing, and that we derive a certain sense of comfort and solidarity through that. We go on social media for entertainment purposes. I do. If you have a dog and post pictures of your dog, then definitely follow me on social media. I want to see your dogs. So there's that too. So there's a lot of positive things that come out of social media. I don't want to, kind of this isn't an anti-social media kind of diatribe. And really the best way I've thought of describing social media and why we do it, or why I personally do it, is it increases serendipity, right? It gets us out of it. We interact with people, we discover things that we just normally would not in the course of our everyday lives. So there's a lot of good. There's a lot of reasons why social media can be changing our lives for the better. Some of the more problematic things, and there's a couple books if you're interested in this topic. Sherry Turkle at MIT published a couple books, and this is based on her research, in terms of just what social media is doing to our interpersonal relationships with other people. So I'm going to talk about this in a second too, but she has all kinds of examples that she's used in her own research in terms of just the mere presence of having a smartphone visible, in an area when we were doing face-to-face conversations, and these things we're more likely to not get as in-depth, as emotionally engaged with each other, because there was always the fear of constant interruption and these sort of things. And Turkle's recent book, Reclaiming Conversation, is also very interesting, I think, because she does talk about actual conversation, not just, communication. So it's a question of quality and depth of connection rather than necessarily quantity of superficial things. The other thing that I wonder about a little bit, I've noticed this personally too, really over the past 4 or 5 years, let's say, it feels like there's more of a polarization. I picked this headline from the conversation, but it's the idea of I'm right, you're wrong. We kind of lose the capacity for a little more ambiguity. And I feel like that's a little bit because of the inherent structure of social media. There's only on Facebook, there's only on Twitter or retweet. Reddit has upvote, downvote, and these sort of things, but those are very binary, right? Yes, no, like, dislike, love, hate, these sort of things. I wonder about that. And of course, there's challenges when it comes to, we talked about this a little bit earlier, about the presence of, misinformation and the fact that we're prone to bubbles. The thing about social media too is especially my last point about kind of different bubbles that we all live in online. Social media just replicates what we do in real life. At a university here in Cambridge, we're in a bubble. The Silicon Valley was very much its own bubble, working at a Google or these sort of things. It's kind of where those bubbles actually do interact and connect, which goes to my previous slide, that I think there's the most capacity for good. And then I'll wrap up a little bit because I want to make sure we have time for questions, but just also thinking about ourselves and other people. I've kind of just been wondering about this in general too, and I don't really have a good answer for it, but the idea that, isn't it weird that sometimes we're so engaged with other people and strangers that we'll probably never met and never will meet in real life, but sometimes that comes at the expense of the people right in front of our face, the people who we like, love, these sort of things. And I wonder why we do that. And I wonder, sometimes we want that serendipity, it's the thrill of the unknown. But yeah, I just wanted to really, these several slides are just ways to give us thinking prompts to sort of hit the pause button a little bit and just think about some of our online behavior. The last point I'm just going to make is in terms of, and I've been thinking about this question a lot in my own research lately, the question of likes, let's say likes for the lack of a better term, but whether we're talking about Facebook or other platforms, this is our way of registering some sort of, positive impact on it. Facebook, of course, did kind of, broaden the range so that now we can be, amused or shocked or unhappy or angry and these sort of things. So that gives a little more subtlety, I guess, to the idea. But I just wonder in general, I've been thinking about this more and more in terms of, we can't measure everything, right? If you're to I'd be curious as a question, if anyone wants to answer this in a little bit, what is the right amount of likes for you? If you had the big life event, right? In terms of you had the new baby, or you graduated, got the new job, what is the number of likes that would make you happy? And I feel like there is no way to really answer that question. I got 200 likes on this thing. But what would be really nice is 201. I don't know. There's the point of this question is just to kind of think in terms of, it's amazing what they've done. One book, in case you're kind of interested in just thinking about some of these things, I really like Lee Humphrey's book. I think this was MIT Press, The Qualified Self, and she talks about a number of different things related to some of these questions that I'm posing. So this is kind of a shorthand way of raising some issues, and maybe we'll talk about these things more in the question and answer segment. I'll wrap up very briefly. And since my own research is on digital distractions, I think about all these things in terms of all of it is intentional, right? The fact that, like James was talking about, some of the smartest, engineers, UI designers in the world decide that it's this shade of red that's going to make us really catch attention. It's things like infinite scroll, the idea that this is what keeps us engaged, and it makes it so much easier to keep staying on these platforms. Infinite scroll is the one that I'd be curious about your own experiences with it, but this is the one I'm probably potentially most worried about in terms of when Amy was talking about kind of passive and active forms of engagement. Infinite scroll is the ultimate just sort of mainlining of content. And then infinite scroll is essentially, if you've used TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, any of these things, it is exactly what it sounds like. You can just scroll and scroll forever, and it's really easy to do, and it's really easy to zone out. I don't feel good when I do it for long periods of time. I'm not saying never do it, but it is one of those things that I wonder, like, people always talk about going down the rabbit hole of these sort of things, and it just goes on and on. That's the one that I probably spend the most time kind of thinking about in terms of like, will it always be like this? What will be different in the near future? Anyways, I should stop talking so that we have more time for questions and your interesting stuff. I thought I would give a plug too for the, in terms of resources, if you're interested, I'll put this on Twitter later if you're useful, but the Center for Humane Technology has some really good tips, I feel like, just in terms of you're thinking about kind of refashioning your environment, ways that maybe you don't have to be online or check your phone less often. And some of it is as simple as turning off notifications, keeping your device out of hand's reach, whether you're doing work or especially at night going to bed, which is one of my favorite tips. But I will leave that at that. So I'll post some links later in case anyone are interested, but I'm going to pipe down for a little bit. So that's it. Get in touch if you have any questions about specific things. And then I think the rest of the time would just be questions and hearing from you guys.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tyler. That's really good. Some really nice tips there, though you scrolled too fast past them. We need a bit of a slower scroll there. Can I invite the rest of the panel to join us back online here now so we can see everybody? And we've had loads and loads of questions. I think we're coming up to about 30 questions thrown in. We are not going to be able to get through all of them. And if I can just say to the panel, ideally when you're not speaking, if there are questions which are particularly targeted at you, if you press the type answer button there, you can type things. So, questions about your own specific research, do feel free to put in there. And I want to explore a few things. So there's been a few questions which have asked about how social media changes us as people. So there's one question, if I can just find out where it was, from anonymous attendee who comes to a lot of our events. Actually, they're one of our most regular attendees. Do you reckon social media is a platform that only projects a tiny part of ourselves, a desired slice of reality? And we also heard from Garth Wilkinson, going back to Amy's thing about horror and crime, that modern social media focuses a lot on fashion and narcissism, and that leads particularly teenagers to have this focus on perfection. Is that a cause of negative effects on well-being? So how much is social media hiding who we really are and projecting only a small amount that's either more vulnerable or in some cases more aggressive? Amy?
I think there is, what I find interesting about social media is naturally, if we think about teenage development, which is kind of my area of research, then that is a time where we really develop our self-concept. So social media, where we nail down that, or where we can experiment with multiple different profiles, for example, is very interesting to think about self-presentation. And something that comes up again and again in multiple disciplines that research social media is the idea of context collapse. So that social media collapses us. We might be quite diverse people to different people. So, me to my parents is different to me to my partner, to me to my kids, me to my students, me to the world. While on Twitter, I'm the same person to kind of everyone, and everybody can see. So I think that's a really interesting challenge. About that we need to be perfection on social media, I do think that this is starting to change. So as I said at the beginning of my talk, I talked to some really interesting teens today who, quite a couple of them were saying that, they actually like following body positive people on Instagram, people with disabilities, people who are maybe, identify like they're identifying or have gone through similar kind of things that they have gone through. And they say that actually I can relate to these people a lot more to people in the media or in the movies. And so it actually allows them to explore more. So I think while naturally we feel like there's a lot of perfection, there's actually quite a lot of imperfection and understanding in certain areas of social media. So again, it really depends on what type, what people are following there. So yeah, I think it's the context collapse that is very interesting for me. The many different profiles, and that teens have a lot of profiles now, often on the same platform. And yeah, this perfection might be different for different people.
Fascinating. Tyler?
I was going to say that, yeah, it is a tricky question. That one of the things that I really like is kind of like the rise in more things like Instagram versus reality, because it was getting to such a point where with filters and these sort of things, like people stop looking human, man. Like it was just kind of like no one has that smooth of a face and these kind of like creepy eyes sort of things. But to actually show the two, and I was like, okay, so if you treat it like a magic trick and it's like, here's the stage version, but we'll also show you the real life behind, I feel like that's healthier. And I kind of like, there's something to that I feel like, we didn't really see that a few years ago, or like say like 4 or 5 years ago. So I feel like that's a step in the right direction. We do curate ourselves. I think, some of it is intentional, some of it is non-intentional, but it's just even the act of kind of like thinking through that in terms of like, who is our audience for this? Sometimes I'll post dumb jokes, and if it doesn't get any, likes, and I was like, well, I thought it was funny. So sometimes that's okay, but I mean, it is a tricky question in terms of, especially the perfection thing, especially now. I don't know. I don't know how to fully answer that question. I think that is a good question, though.
James?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. I mean, I do separate out the questions of are the social media, or whatever we call them, are they simplifying down certain attributes of life that we understand our identity based on, versus are those desired by us? I don't think, I've never met anybody who like thinks this form of expression and interaction is the perfect one for me or for humanity in general. So I think we could all come up with.
I think we'll have to come back to hear the rest of James's thoughts in a moment. So I wanted to ask a bit about responsibility, because it's something that all of you touched on a bit. Who actually has responsibility for tackling what we do about social media? Should it be about government legislation, some of the online harms proposals, some of the big pieces there? Is it about individual behaviours? And if so, what should we be saying to people? Is it the responsibility of the social media companies to be taking action to protect us from the bad things and enhancing the good things? James, if you can hear me, do you want to speak now?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I would say in a broadly speaking, it's the responsibility of whoever has the most power to make the needed change. So, I think there's very little individuals can do to sort of affect the systemic questions that we're talking about here. I mean, there are little bandages you can put on kind of the situation here and there, but in terms of really changing the landscape, it requires organization, political action, advocacy, this kind of thing.
Thanks. Tyler, Amy, who's responsible?
I can add something that, I mean, the kind of maybe unsatisfying answer is sort of all of the above, in terms of like, yeah, so we've tried the self-policing route of big tech companies. I feel like, government has I feel like government will catch up in terms of legislation. I've been saying that for a while, but at some point, it won't always be like this. But I also feel like the solution can't just be like from the tech companies and government ourselves, because that kind of doesn't give us enough credit too. I feel like, things like the social dilemma really seem to spur some quite a debate in the kind of public consciousness, which is great. The thing that's sort of important is how do we go from sparking those sort of things? Like we've had some kind of like landmark moments, right? Like Cambridge Analytica, for example, or election sort of things that have certainly raised consciousness. But I don't really have an answer for this other than over kind of different spheres coming together and really working on this. How do we go from I'm really worried about this, and then boom, by the time the weekend comes along and it's like, and then by next week nothing happens. So we go from concern to how do we keep the concern going that then leads to meaningful action and change? I don't know, but we have to start somewhere, and we have.
Amy?
I think there are ways we've been trying to patch things up as we go, which we know don't 100% work. So I remember quite vividly being at a kind of policy conference at Ofcom, trying to figure out what we should do about tech for kids. And somehow the policy solution everybody comes up with when there's no other solution is, oh, let's have an education campaign and let's make the schools do it. And I think it was very memorable there that a tech activist kind of for responsible tech actually stood up and said, we can't do this again and again. We need to find other forms of responsibility. And I think that, there are, the government is trying to think about new ways to have digital responsibility. I'm really interested in the idea of a data levy on tech companies that we actually understand what's going on. And it's not just, I often say I could quit my job on a Friday afternoon, then take a job at a big tech company and do all the research I ever always wanted to do on all the data. But not naturally, it's then not openly available. And it's naturally a bit of an oversimplification, but I think there needs to be a lot more public understanding around technology, because if we would understand these small design decisions, we could then legislate, we know that this decision causes this and this impact, and we as a society think that's not okay. And so we don't, but without that knowledge, we cannot have good regulation or policy. So I think that these ideas around data levies, data donation via GDPR are things that really excite me, and I think could really change the field in the next 10 years through academia. I guess this is at universities, so we can kind of say that academics have a role to play as well.
Can I just press you on this, because you talked about how people always call for more education and then essentially argued for more education. Is it that we need to educate the public, or we need to educate policymakers and regulators? What's the balance? I mean, this is for Amy first, but I'd be interested in everybody's thoughts.
I think it's difficult. There's a disconnect. If I talk to policymakers, it's a completely different conversation than when I talk to, for example, teenage users. Today, I was kept on trying to get to, do you feel like you spend too much time online? And they never really what they want to talk about is content, and, how do we police content? What is free speech versus, hate speech, and how do we do that? And trigger warnings and all of these things that fire them up. So I think what we need is education on all levels. But I think we need, I truly believe that we need more public facing understanding about what the tech decisions are, what the impacts are, and that could lead to more insights and better response. Then we can take better responsibility. Always say, we wouldn't plan an A road throughout the whole country without really thinking about where to put it, but we pivot, our online classroom towards certain technology without really doing any of that due diligence. But that's not because we maybe don't want to, it's because it's currently impossible to do. So I think education on all levels, but we also need the material to educate people, and I think we're still lacking there as well.
James, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe a general kind of educational need across all stages of education about what we know now about human psychology and decision making, and kind of just not only for our own benefit, but also to understand some of the kind of mechanisms, persuasive mechanisms that designers, platforms, et cetera, use. So I think there's a big opportunity there. But I also think to the extent that a lot of this extends from kind of the logic and the business model of advertising, I think that there's a big opportunity to kind of revisit and re-educate about what actually is advertising, what counts as advertising, what is it for? Because I think that's another piece of a lot of this, is that we just kind of haven't really reevaluated that for a while. So I think that there's a big the advertising and marketing industry is one of the biggest things that affects people's lives and their thinking and interactions, and there's not a whole lot of education about that. I think it's necessary, I think, but it's not, of course, sufficient for the big goals of reform.
Tyler.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, like in my so pre-Google days, I was a school teacher, taught reading and writing composition and social studies. I also did work like with schools and everything. So that's a tricky question. I worry that the kind of like top to bottom approach of just sort of big committees have their guidelines and everything, and then the head of school or whoever the person kind of hands it down. Doesn't seem to be working that well. That's just my kind of subjective opinion. My ideal scenario, how realistic it is, I don't know, but there are some teachers who just totally get it. A more bottom-up approach in terms of if there are a way to give those people, the teachers who are in the trenches and the ones who are just doing kind of amazing things with social media, everything from, I've just seen, they're brilliant. I want to see them be able to have more of a thing and just sort of kind of start there with their communities, which they're already doing, but more of that. So that is more of a bottom up approach. I just feel like that is more of a way to success. Maybe that's just kind of revealing what my worldview is, that I think that change does come from the bottom up, but that'd be my vote.
So we've had a lot of questions about harms from social media. There are questions about the lack of reality checking, issues, the problems that it causes for democracy, the problems with journalists just repeating what they see on Twitter, state actor cyberbots, all sorts of other things. We might come back to those negatives, but we've had a couple of questions that I wanted to put, which were really about the positives. So there's two questions here. So one from our dear friend, anonymous attendee, who says, I've been struggling with quitting social media. The reason I come back to it every time is seeking justice. I'm aware most of it can be pretentious and performative, but in Turkey, it genuinely works. They give the example recently of the Bagaci protests and femicides. Justice is served with hashtags in my country. How do you balance the addiction and the constant need to check the news and join in with the benefits of having a legal, that at least you can get some access to a legal system through Twitter and Instagram? And similarly, we have an economist, Ravi Bulchandani, who says, look, all the talk's harms, but hundreds of millions of sensible, mature people take huge satisfaction from the benefits they get from social media. As an economist, I worry that the great benefits experienced by many people get overshadowed by the harms that articulate and influential people wish to regulate. So what are the good things? How do we maximize those? Tyler.
Oh, I was just going to nominate James because I feel like that's totally a James question, but that might not be fair.
James, is it a fair question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly, I think as one of you guys said before, I think we're all at the end of the day pro technology, which is I think why we think about it and study it so much, because I think we see the potential that it can have for our lives, for humanity in general. So I mean, I think broadly speaking, I'd say that the question is about the standards and the kind of the process for the design of the technologies that shape our lives. So what are those standards that we want it to meet? And in some ways it meets those standards. I can have we're having this meeting right now. I can talk with my family back in the U.S. and you can get attention for certain things that it was very hard to get attention for previously, politically, societally. So of course there are good effects, but I think it's similar to saying, go back to the climate change metaphor. I mean, there are going to be places in the world that are going to be really, really nice after climate change. Like Siberia is going to be amazing, but it's not the case that we could say, well, let's just let it keep going and then move everybody to those places. There's still like a systemic problem that is sort of behind it all that needs to be fixed. So I think it's the question of what are those targets, what are the standards, and then that's a question for ethicists, for thinkers, and political philosophers, for all of society, to really understand that, and then basically what is the process? How do we ensure that we have the right kind of deliberation, the right kind of control over these kind of essentially new forms of government that shape our lives. So I think that it's because we're having these conversations because we see the potential benefits are so much greater than the current ones that we get right now. So.
Jamie Susskind has a book coming out that explores some of these ideas. Amy, are you?
Well, I think something I could add to that is mainly I'm currently in the process of supervising my first PhD student, and something that really interested me and caught my eye when we had our first conversations, which made me want to work with her, was her kind of more or less turning around saying, Amy, you're answering privileged questions for very privileged portions of the world and society. And I do think that as researchers, we ask questions, I answer questions from people editors in the media or policymakers or funders, and they're all, one, you have an age difference, but then you also have the kind of country difference in the world itself. And so I do think that sometimes the very concerns-focused view is very particular, while, for example, if we think about the global south, where access to a smartphone can really be life-changing and where things are having kind of very positive impact, the conversation becomes very different. I think the negative and the positive can really coexist at the same time, and I think that's what makes this so hard to answer. Because you can have, and I really like James's kind of different levels approach. We have personal level, we have society level, and so you might have these personal level positives, while you might say actually, but polarization is still happening, or these issues are still happening, even if on a personal level having access to that smartphone can be really, really positive, or being able to contact your family overseas. So I think we need to live in a world where things aren't that black and white. So there are clear benefits. I wouldn't be where I'm now without Twitter. It's been a core part of my research career. A lot of parts of careers of younger people has been social media itself. So yeah, but I think we need to, sometimes I ask myself, what is the question that I'm answering? Why am I answering it? And as academics, that is often because it kind of trickles down, top down. But I think if we answer questions bottom up, we might be seeing much more of a balance of positives and negatives. But maybe that's just my view, and it changes every week. My view on this issue. Yeah,
we'll have to invite you back next week to find out.
Yeah.
Tyler, did you have your own answer or just James's answer?
I don't know. I think James's answer is pretty good, and so is Amy's. This is a complicated question. I mean, yeah, like to kind of take a step back and think, and it was like, yeah, there are really good things, undeniably good things that have happened because of social media. And I don't want to lose sight of that. Like we're talking about the online harms and all of the things. I don't want social media our profiles to disappear necessarily tomorrow morning. I don't know. That's the tricky thing. And James can relate to this too with kind of tech and platforms in general. But things are always designed one way, but then used in unexpected ways by the users. And that's kind of both the amazing part, but also the frustrating part. I don't know. I don't have a good straight answer for this, I guess.
We are almost out of time, and we have 30-ish questions we haven't managed to get to. Some really wonderful ones. There's a link from Neve McLaughlin to a TED talk that she's given if you look in the answer questions. But I'm going to finish with one sort of generic question for all three of you. We've had a question that's come in about what the future might look like. So what do you think is going to happen over the next 5-10 years? What will the future be of social media when we gather for our reunion in 10 years' time, when we may be even allowed into the same space as each other and within a couple of meters? What would we be saying then about social media? And do leave in it with a bit of your own hopes for social media as well as what you think might happen. Shall I do this in reverse order that we started? So I think that means, Tyler, you're the first one to predict the future.
Okay, let's see. So my first answer would be, I've always had this idea for a short story, even though I'm not a fiction writer, that the future would be kind of like people our age and above would be the ones that are addicted to all the social media things. And then the younger generation would be kind of like, what is wrong with older adults now? Why don't they go outside more? Don't they realize offline life is great? So that's my kind of funny scenario. No one take my idea. Creative Commons licensing on that. My realistic change, in the near future is, I think more of the same, but I think some things will start to be more structured. That's just my opinion in terms of the current Parliament asked Zuckerberg to come and talk about things, and whatever. I think that'll be a little different in 10 years. What that means, I think we'll be more aware, because we're all learning as we go. Like longitudinal studies and all of these things, we don't know. We're all part of one big social experiment right now to find out if, all of this, was it much ado about nothing? Was it totally fine? Are we going to be better off? Are we going to be totally messed up? We'll find out in 10 years. But I don't think it'll look dramatically different than it is right now, but I think we'll be more knowledgeable. So that's like my optimistic / pragmatic answer.
James.
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's hard enough to even be able to say what's happening right now, much less in the future. But I mean, I think to me, like there are a couple big, dependencies. I think the answer will depend on to what extent an organized kind of movement or a project of resistance or even like rebellion against some of the externalities of all this kind of congeals and can set those standards, and then has the kind of can get the right kind of attention, the right kind of political will to make the right kind of structural changes. I mean, I don't think 4 or 5 years. I mean, I think probably we're talking like a generational time frame for these kinds of things, a lot, if not more. And it also depends on sort of what other kinds of technology come out between now and then. But I mean, I do foresee a scenario where there are certain people who are committed to a certain kind of, whether you call it like the reading mind or a certain kind of interiority, a certain kind of linearity, a certain kind of appreciation for sort of the complex pleasures of life and not the simple ones. That comes under a kind of a common banner, and essentially is not a kind of Luddite thing, but almost just a kind of like almost like a cleaving of society along media preference lines. I mean, that's one scenario you could imagine, but I mean, it's super hard to predict. So.
Yeah, I mean, polarization is a theme we touched on but didn't really discuss today, and there's a huge issue which the Intellectual Forum is going to be coming back to over the next few months. Amy, over to you.
Yeah, I can't predict the future. If not, I guess I'd have a different, higher paying job. But I think I have two comments, one on Tyler and one on James's point. So Tyler talked about, we're in this massive social experiment. And I trained in natural sciences here at the university. And for an experiment, we need another group, a comparison group of some sorts. And we don't have that in life, and in history. It's often we just change. And it's a big philosophical question then. Was this change good or bad? And people just kind of forget, like with the radio now, we just move on somehow. And all of a sudden people don't, in generation on, we don't really remember a lot of things. So I think just from my research in the historical view, I do think that people just forget, and then we just continue because there is no comparison. There is no paper at the end that somebody can write. Whether that's good or bad is another thing, and so I think that's just something that we have to deal with, and we never really deal with as society because it's just this forgetting cycle. And the other one was that I think the main thing that I wish not to happen is that for a lot of changes in society, we see that everybody's like the pandemic as well. I sit on the British Academy Public Policy Committee, and we've been working on a big report on the pandemic. And there it's this, what we say is more or less something along the lines of, we've all gone through the same event, but we've not been in the same boat. Those who are already, disadvantaged, more vulnerable, are those who are more negatively impacted. And I think more and more we're seeing that might be happening online as well. And I think we need to try double as hard that we have digital equality and not inequality, and that our digital platforms allow that. Don't kind of make the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So my hope is for the future is that this won't occur, but I think that's something that I think we'll increasingly talk about in the next few years, because I think that will be an increasing issue.
Very, very important point. I'm tempted to combine your comments about experiments with Tyler's question about deleting social media. Maybe we should just randomly delete social media accounts for half of the world's population, and then find out which half does better afterwards. But maybe that's too big an experiment for us. Tyler, Amy, James, that's, I'm afraid, all we have time for. But thank you all very, very much for joining us from around Europe, at least. And it's been a real pleasure to have you here to talk about this. There's a lot more, and this is a subject that we're going to be coming back to at various points in the future. And thanks to all of you who've joined us for this evening's event. This has been part of the Cambridge Festival, produced by the Jesus College Intellectual Forum and the ThinkLab at the University of Cambridge. Certainly, we hope that you'll join us for other events here at Jesus College. So on Wednesday, we're going to be moving to work out how to fix the financial system, particularly focusing on climate. And how do we make sure that the financial world works to fix our climate rather than to destroy it? So the other half of James's pairing. We're then talking about atoms on Saturday and ripples on Monday, looking at both the scientific aspects, but also the artistic and aesthetic effects of that. And we have an amazing programme for you after Easter as well. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. We hope to see you at some point soon. Have a very good evening.